Lisa Rubel of Love to Color My World, and I'm here to walk you through block 2 of the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month quilt. So block number 2 is a star block. It looks like this, and on our quilt it's right down here. We've got a gray center, yellow star tips, and a white tonal background. So let's get started making this block. So I've got my pieces cut already. I've got my center gray square, some smaller gray and yellow squares, and then white background corners. So the first thing that we're going to do is to make the star points. And we're going to start out by flipping the 2 yellow squares upside down and drawing a line on the back of each of them so we can make half square triangles. So I've got my fabric marking pen and my ruler. I'm going to draw those lines. So I'll layer each yellow square with a gray one, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from each side of that drawn line on both of these. So I've got my line stitched, and the next step is to put my ruler back on that marked line and cut them apart. And now I've got yellow and gray half square triangle units. So I'm going to press these open, and I'm pressing the seam to the darker fabric, which here is my gray print. All right, 2 more to do. And so what we're making is sort of like a partial hourglass unit, because we will be joining these with a white square using the same method. And that will give us that tip of the yellow and the gray. So I'm going to trim down my half square triangle unit to measure 4 inches. And that's just taking just a little tiny bit off of all sides, but then I can align it with my white square a little more accurately. So I've got my white square, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did earlier, and I'm going to draw a line on the wrong side of it from corner to corner. And then I'm going to position that on my gray and yellow half square triangle so that the line runs perpendicular to my seam line here, just like that. And then just like before, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of those drawn lines. So I've stitched on both sides of that drawn line, and I'm going to cut on the line. And then if you look, if I open this one, I've got the yellow here and the gray here. And if I open this one, it is actually the mirror image. They're opposite each other. And that is great because that allows us to position our star points correctly. So I'm going to take these over and iron them, press them open, and then we'll trim them down to size. Okay. So you want to use your diagonal lines here to make sure that you trim it as accurately as possible. So I'm going to line up my diagonal line here with that seam between the white and the gray and the yellow. And I'm going to trim these to 3.5. So I'm going to look and make sure that on the bottom that the 3.5 marks are still on my half square triangle. And then I trim 2 at a time. And then I'm going to turn it around. And now I'm going to line up the 3.5 inch lines on my nicely cut edges, and then also make sure that this diagonal line on the ruler is in the seam line. And so when I cut this, you end up with this partial hourglass unit where the seams go into 3 of the 4 corners, and then this side is just that one piece of fabric. So you're going to repeat this with the rest of your half square triangles and your white squares so that you end up with 8 of this unit. So when I press these units, I am pressing them toward the white fabric, because even though you've got the opportunity for a little showing through, it allows me to have this seam pressed flat, whereas if I pressed it the other way, it would bend back on itself and it would create more of a bulky spot. So once you have all 8 of your star point units, these yellow, gray, and white units, pieced and trimmed to size, now we're going to put the block together. So remember how I pointed out that these are actually mirror images of each other with the placement of the gray and yellow? So I've got them sorted into 2 piles, and I'm going to use that to make my yellow star tips. So I'm going to take one from that pile and one from the second pile, and you can see I've got my yellow tips pointed out and the gray touching my center square. So I'm going to do the same thing down here at the bottom, and then on both sides. Okay, so before I start sewing, I just want to make sure I've got all my yellow points out, my gray touching my center square, and then I'm going to put the background corners in. So what we're going to do to sew this all together is to sew these 2 units together and these 2 units together, and then we'll join them to the center square, and then we'll sew these 2 rows together and sew them to the center square. So for sewing these 2 units, make sure that when you fold them, they don't change direction, and you want to line them up and just look to make sure that your points at the corner, that the seams match as much as possible. I'm going to put a pin or 2 in to hold this. And then we're just going to sew right down this line with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and do the same over on this side as well. Okay, so I've got my side units done, and I am going to press it. I'm just going to press the seam to one side and do the same on this second one. And then we'll line these up with that center square. Move these guys out of the way. So I'm going to line it up like this, and they should be the same length if your piecing is accurate. And then what I like to do is to pin at both ends first, so that I've got my piece secure. And then for this middle pin, you want to be sewing right above where that diagonal seam comes in, because that will give you the cleanest points. So you can see it here, but I also like to put a pin in that kind of shows me what I need to be aiming for. So I'm going to aim for where the pin goes into the fabric, and that is right where that seam line is as well. So I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down this side, making sure that I hit that point, and then add the piece on the other side in the same way. So I've got my units on the side joined, and I'm going to press these toward the center square because of all that bulk from our partial hourglass units. That means I'm not folding that bulk over on itself. And if we take a look, if you look here, you can see that my seam line is just right at the top of that point. So I've got a real nice point there. So I've got these units sewn together. Now the next step is to sew these 4 together. So we'll do the center in the same way, where you're making sure your seams are aligned in the middle, and then sew the squares to both sides so that we've got a pieced row for the top and a pieced row for the bottom to add on to our block center. So I've got my top and bottom borders all pieced, and now it's time to press them. And for pressing them, the center seam between the 2 star points you can press in either direction, but the 2 seams that go to your corner backgrounds, you want to press out toward that background fabric. And the reason for that is twofold. The first is then you're not folding that bulk over on itself, so it's just will lay a little flatter. And the second is when we go to sew these top and bottom rows onto our quilt, our block center, the seams on the center section are pressed inward, and with these ones pressed outward, when you go to line them up, your seams will nest, and that will make your joins a little easier to do, and the fabric will just tuck itself right in place. So I'm going to put the pins in on both of those seams, and I can also see there's where the two seams cross, so that's where I want my seam allowance, that's where I want my stitches to go, so that I get nice crisp points. Then I'll put one more at the end, one in the middle. Now in theory, if you're sewing with a good 1/4 inch seam allowance, you should just be able to sew that 1/4 inch and hit all of these points. But sometimes it's a little bit off, and that's why I like to just keep an eye on where those stitch lines join, because then I can make sure that I get nice points. So I'm going to pin the opposite end on as well. And then once I sew these two seams and press the quilt block, number 2 will be done. So I've got my top and bottom rows added on, and here's my finished block. All that I need to do is press it. I am going to press these seams toward the center of the block. You can go in either direction or press them open if you like, but because of where the majority of the bulk is, that's just how I've chosen to press it. And your block should measure 12.5 inches square. And over the course of this block of the month, we'll be making 12 blocks, and then we'll assemble them with sashing and borders to finish it. So here is block number 2, one of the several star blocks in this block of the month quilt. So I hope you enjoyed making block number 2, and I can't wait to see you next month for block number 3.